Welcome to part 3 of the origins of the Cold War. Now we're going to take a look at the Berlin Airlift. With Germany being partitioned, it truly became the front line in the European Cold War, right? And Berlin was kind of an interesting component on it. Because remember, it was partitioned too. So you had the 3 western sectors that were controlled by France, Britain, and the United States, and then you had the eastern sector controlled by the Soviets. So you had an East Berlin and a West Berlin. But the city itself was located right in the middle of East Germany. So you had half of a western city in the middle of communist territory. Stalin came to believe that Truman may talk a big game, but he's not going to fight a war for half a city. And from Stalin's point of view, this is a pretty big risk to take. I mean, you think about it, he's going to take actions in Berlin to try and take over the western half of it in 1948, when the United States was the only nuclear superpower. They were the only ones with nuclear weapons. The Soviets hadn't even tested their first ones yet. But he thought, no way, Truman's going to fight a war for half a city. So on June 24th, 1948, the Soviets cut off all road, railroad, and water access to West Berlin. The idea was simply this: we'll just isolate it so you can't get supplies into the city won't be able to sustain itself, Truman won't fight for half a city, and the whole thing will fall to us, right? The only way you're getting anything in or out of West Berlin was by aircraft. Why? Well, because it's easy to close a border. It's easy to close a road. It's very difficult to close an air lane, right? If you start doing that by shooting down the planes that are coming into West Berlin, well, that's an escalation. And then, of course, ultimately that's the risk of a nuclear exchange. But you can't supply a city from just the air. Or can you? Truman's advisors said that they believed they could. So beginning on June 24th and continuing for almost 11 months until May 12th, 1949, so from June 24th, 1948 to May 12th, 1949, 321 days, they are going to supply West Berlin by air in what becomes known as the Berlin Airlift, right? A plane will land in West Berlin every 3 minutes for 321 days, dropping off every kind of supplies and necessities that you can think of. Toilet paper, medical supplies, school books, clothes, heating fuel, you name it, it was being dropped off, right? An interesting story during this Berlin airlift was one of a colonel in the United States Air Force named Gale Haverson. Gale Haverson, at the time when the call for pilots first went out across the Air Force, was stationed in Oklahoma. And he was also suffering from a terrible sinus infection. But they needed volunteers to fly these planes, right? And they needed them immediately. And so he dropped everything. He packed a suitcase, including loading in as many handkerchiefs as he could because of his sinus infection. And off he went towards and flew to Germany, right, as a volunteer to fly these aircraft in the Berlin Airlift. Now, it seems like once he got to Oklahoma, the sinus issues cleared up almost instantly. I don't know if that's a commentary on Oklahoma, right? But he began making these runs into Berlin. And typically a pilot here in the first stages would make 3 runs per day. They would fly for 6 days, and they were given 1 day off. On his day off, Haverson stayed in West Berlin. And he was wandering around West Berlin when he noticed that there was a group of children that were hanging around the fence line for the Tempelhof Airport, right, watching these planes come in. And you think about it, this is probably a pretty exciting time if you're a child in West Berlin. You got these planes coming in every 3 minutes, and everybody's all tense. It's a scary, tense time. And so he goes up and he talks to these kids. And they're talking about how excited they are watching these planes coming in. And he says, well, I'm one of the pilots of these planes. And now all of a sudden these kids, it's like they got a superhero. It's like if Iron Man had just landed in front of them, right? And so he tells them, he says, I'll tell you what, when I'm making my flights tomorrow, when I come in on final approach, I'll drop some candy down for you. Well, they said, well, how do we know it's you? Right? He says, well, as I'm coming in, I'll wiggle my wings back and forth so you know it's me, right? And so he immediately is given the nickname Mr. Wiggly Wings, right? So On the first day when he's flying again, he's got candy all set, ready to go, and he's coming in on his final approach, and there's all the children. He wiggles his wings, and they get all excited, and he throws the candy out the door, and it comes down, strikes, and kills 4 kids. Okay, I'm just kidding. He'd actually rigged parachutes out of these handkerchiefs that he brought with him for him. That probably wasn't even necessary. There's this thing called terminal velocity. You can't get a Snickers bar to fly fast enough to hurt somebody, seriously anyways. So this candy comes floating in on these parachutes, right? And he begins doing this regularly, right? Every time he flies in, Mr. Wiggly Wings, the candy bomber, will come in and he'll drop the candy on these guys, right? Now, this is technically a violation of orders, him doing this, right? He's stepping outside the boundaries of his orders, and if he got caught doing this, well, he technically could get court-martialed. But, who's to know, right? Well, the thing is that word very quickly spreads in West Berlin about the candy bomber. Matter of fact, it starts showing up in West Berlin newspapers, and then that news filters its way back to the States, where the American Confectioners Association hears about it and then volunteers to send tons of candy to General William Turner, the commander of the base operating the planes in the Berlin Airlift. So all of a sudden, General William Turner gets this letter from the American Confectioners Association saying, hey, we're going to send you tons of candy for the candy bomber. And he's like, what? So he immediately goes out and says, all right, who is this candy bomber? And Gil Haverson does stand up and say, yeah, it's me. Now, technically, like I said, he could be court-martialed right here. But, I mean, think about it. You're going to really court-martial a guy that's dropping candy on kids? Now, what he does is he expands the program. He creates a program called Operation Little Vittles. And now all these pilots begin dropping candy on these kids. 25 pilots just from Haverson's squadron alone begin dropping candy on approach into Berlin. Matter of fact, during the course of the Berlin Airlift, 23 tons of candy, chocolate, gum are dropped on the children of Berlin. And you probably had to start ferrying in dentists at some point here too. Gil Haverson, of course, is an interesting individual. Afterwards, he's going to create Operation Hope, which is a charitable organization to provide aid to children in refugees areas, and he'll even become ambassador to the United Nations, right? For West Berlin itself, after 321 days, Stalin realizes that Truman is going to fight for half a city, and so he goes ahead and he backs down. Right. This is a great victory for Truman here in the Cold War, the maintaining of West Berlin. But issues with Berlin are going to come up again with later presidents.